Hi, I'm Stuart Muir. Welcome to Higher Ground, the only show dedicated to finding common ground in the contentious debate over BC's natural resources. We have a very special show in store for you today as we're being joined by Dr. Patrick Moore, who is a co-founder of Greenpeace, the environmental advocacy group formed here in Vancouver in the early 1970s. Dr. Moore holds a PhD in ecology and spent 15 years with Greenpeace fighting to save the world from nuclear destruction. However, he parted ways with Greenpeace in 1986 after the group became, he felt, more interested in politics than science. Sound familiar? We caught up with Dr. Moore to talk in depth about the natural resource debate and, of course, finding common ground. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Moore.
It's nice to be with you, Stuart.
Dr. Moore, you have spoken out a lot about your position on climate change. Could you tell our viewers what that position is?
Well, first, the climate of the Earth has been changing since it was formed 4.6 billion years ago on a pretty regular basis. It's not as if this is something new. We have this record of recent climate change, of warming of the Earth that's gone in fits and starts. It warmed between 1910 and 1940, and then it cooled off a bit in the 50s and 60s. Then it warmed again between 1970 and 2000, and since 2000 it's been flat. Even though during that time, humans have emitted about a quarter of all the CO2 they've ever put in the atmosphere. So the correlation between CO2 and temperature does not seem very strong. It's certainly not in lockstep. And even correlation doesn't prove causation.
Dr. Moore, does that mean, in your opinion, we don't need to be concerned about decreasing our reliance on fossil fuels?
Well, fossil fuels, they're a limited resource. They're very precious in the sense that there's not an infinite amount of them. And so we should really be focused on conserving them and, where we can, using technologies that do not require fossil fuels or require less fossil fuels where they are efficient and cost effective.
Dr. Moore, our internal research at ResourceWorks has identified several opinion clusters among British Columbians and their attitudes toward natural resources. There are the two extremes. The one side is what we call the back to the lander, the anti-everything crowd, and the other extreme is the paver, the drill baby drill crowd. Are you in one of those extremes or somewhere in the middle?
Well, I'm in the middle because many years ago I was introduced to the concept of sustainable development, or sustainability as it's often called today. And the very beginning precept of that is to balance environmental, social, and economic priorities. The social and economic priorities have been with us forever as a civilization. But environmental ones didn't start happening until we began the modern environmental movement in the late 60s, early 70s. So it's been a very short period of time where we have had to try to figure out how to incorporate these new environmental values into the social and economic fabric of our laws and our regulations and our daily activities and behaviors. And that is what sustainability is about figuring out how to work environmental priorities into the absolutely necessary social and economic priorities so we can stay alive every day.
In the 1990s, let's go back to that time, you were with the Forest Alliance of BC. Can you tell us about that organization and the challenges you were facing?
Well, this is after 15 years with Greenpeace. I've come out of Greenpeace because I didn't agree with the direction they were going. I started a salmon farm at my family home on northern Vancouver Island with my brother and my brother-in-law, in other words, a family company. And within a year, I became president of the BC Salmon Farmers Association, which was a fledgling group. But my long experience in Greenpeace gave me a lot of ability to speak in public and to talk about what we were doing. We thought it was a sustainable development to have salmon farming. And suddenly we're confronted by David Suzuki and Greenpeace and everybody else saying that salmon farming is wrong and bad and is destroying things. And so that's where I first came into a sort of reverse situation that I'd been in for many previous years. And I'm going like, wow, if these guys are against salmon farming, what are they in favor of? And that's where I was at that time, trying to figure out what I was in favor of. And in addition to that, my family had been in the forest industry, has been in the forest industry for over 100 years on the north end of Vancouver Island. My grandfather, my father, and now my youngest brother and myself are involved in forestry on a regular basis. And I understand forestry very well and studied it at university. And here you've got now all these people who are basically saying they're against forestry. And I'm going, just a minute. you shouldn't be against forestry. What you should be is in favor of improving it, of making it sustainable forestry, like every other industry is having to go through, back to incorporating the environmental values into the social and economic ones. The environmental aspect, though, was not being looked after properly in all those early years of the industry because no one even thought about it. Once we started thinking about it, it was clear that in order to bring about sustainable forestry, there had to be a lot of changes made in the way the forest industry did its work. So in order to try to deal with the problems the forest industry was facing, the CEOs of the industry created the Forest Alliance of BC, a group of citizens from across the province, former mayors, leaders, thinkers, people who were, prominent in the province, to come together to try to help them deal with their problem. And I was asked at the time by Jack Monroe, who'd been the head of the International Woodworkers, to join that group, which he would be chair of. And I accepted, and I lost half my friends within a week's time, because I couldn't believe it, but the people I'd known all those years working to save the whales and stop nuclear war and all of that actually believed that the forest industry was evil, that I was going over to the dark side. But I'd been in the industry in my family for 100 years, and I knew that it actually produced the most important renewable resource in the whole world, and that it wasn't a question of abolition, it was a question of reform that was necessary. So I joined that group, and immediately we convinced the CEOs that it wasn't what you're saying that people don't like, it's actually what you're doing. It's how you're doing forestry. It doesn't look good to have these huge clear cuts right over the top of mountains. You've got to change that and do it in a more gentle way that's more with the ecology of the land. And you've got to protect the rivers and the biodiversity and take all those things into account. Over a 10-year period, we took public opinion from 33% in favor of the forest industry to 75% in favor of the forest industry, because we convinced them to make the changes they should have made in order to become environmentally responsible. And to me, that was one of the best things I've accomplished in my life.
When you look at the debate today on natural resources, 20 years later, it's different. It's more than just forestry. It's also mining, LNG, oil sands, pipelines. Dr. Moore, do you see a path to compromise like you achieved in the 90s, or is the debate today just too fractured?
Well, in some ways things have got worse in the last 10 or 20 years, because now the whole of development is being challenged, not just forestry or not just a particular mine. And the one that drives me the most crazy is the fact that Greenpeace and the Green Party and the Green movement in general are basically opposed to mining. Not a particular mine somewhere, but every mine everywhere. They're against it. Now, how can you be opposed to mining when you ride a bicycle, or have a cell phone, or have a laptop, or even exist in this world? To be against mining is every building in this whole city is made from mining, except for the wood, which come from trees, which are also against that, even though it's renewable. And they're against hydroelectric dams, and they're against run-of-river hydroelectric, they're against nuclear energy, they're against all fossil fuels, they're basically against about 99% of all the world's energy supply. So there's no reasoning with that crowd. And as far as I'm concerned, I just wish people would marginalize them and write them off as being completely irrelevant to the discussion, but they're not, because they actually have a lot of support among the people who sit in front of their TVs and think they're watching what's happening in the world.
Why do they get so much voice?
I think there's always been a lot of ability to get voice for dissent. Class warfare is not something new, and this is part of class warfare. If you look at the anti-globalization movement, the Occupy movement, and the anti-GMO movement, the anti-nuclear movement, they're all kind of part of the same thread.
Is there a deliberate attempt to undermine trust in our institutions, our regulators, and to propagate information not based on factual analysis?
Well, I mean, one of the main reasons I left Greenpeace back in the 80s was because I saw it sliding into misinformation, into sensationalism, and into using fear as one of its main weapons to get at people's emotions rather than dealing with logic and science. And as a scientist and someone who's been trained in science all my life and have followed the philosophy and history of science, I could not go in that direction. So that's why I had to leave in general. Also, the environmental movement lost the humanitarian orientation it had in the beginning. We were trying to stop all-out nuclear war and the destruction of human civilization. That has a humanitarian element in it. But that was lost, and all of a sudden humans are the enemies of the earth, and everything they do is destruction, instead of seeing everything we do as construction, which of course, a great deal of it is. But even construction is perceived as destruction. So I do think we are in for a long period of very difficult debate, argument, conflict as to how to move forward. And I think it's going to result in the continued poverty of people who could be lifted out of poverty if they would use the modern technologies and sciences that we now have at our disposal. There's 2 million children dying every year from vitamin A deficiency, and the Greens are against the solution, which is golden rice, which has beta-carotene in it. Yes, it's genetically modified to have beta-carotene in it, but every single one of us is genetically modified. We're not the same as our parents. We were modified by the mixing of our mums and dads' genes, and every crop we eat in our breakfast, lunch, and dinner has been modified. The cure is in the can, and yet these people are against it, and that's my fight right now.
Would like to thank Dr. Moore for coming on Higher Ground today for what was a revealing conversation, and would also like to thank you for tuning in. That's it for this week's Higher Ground. Make sure you visit our website at resourceworks.com, sign up for our newsletter, and don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. For ResourceWorks, I'm Stuart Muir.